Hello, my friend. I am glad you are here. However you found your way to this particular corner of the internet tonight, whether it was deliberate, whether you have been here before, whether you stumbled in half asleep already, I am genuinely glad you made it. You came here to rest, and that is exactly what we are going to do together. Before we begin, I want to ask something of you, and I want to ask it honestly. If this channel has ever helped you sleep, or helped you feel a little less alone in the dark, or simply given you something worth thinking about as your mind finally slows down, would you consider leaving a like and perhaps a subscribe? It costs you nothing, truly nothing, and it helps this little channel find someone else out there who needs it. Someone lying awake in a city somewhere, looking for exactly this. That feels worth asking for. Thank you, genuinely. Now, I want to ask where you are tonight, because I think about this often. Who is actually on the other end of this? Maybe you are in a bedroom somewhere in the American Midwest, in one of those houses where the furnace makes that particular low hum all winter long, the kind of sound that has become so familiar you only notice it when it stops. Maybe you are in a flat in London, with the distant sound of the city doing what cities do late at night. A bus, someone's heels on pavement, a siren fading into nothing a few streets away. Or maybe you are somewhere quite far from both of those, a room in New Zealand or South Africa, or somewhere in Southeast Asia where it is already early morning and you have simply not slept yet, and you are hoping this will do what the rest of the night has not. Wherever you are, leave it in the comments. Tell me your town, your country, even just the rough shape of your evening. I read every single one of them, and I mean that, and they matter to me more than I know quite how to say. Now, let's get you comfortable. If you haven't already, dim whatever you can dim. Let your phone screen go as low as it will go. If there are lights in the room, make them softer if you can. Let your shoulders drop, really drop, lower than that. You have been holding them up all day, probably without noticing. Let your jaw unclench. There is almost always more tension in the jaw than we realize. Let it go soft. Let your legs go heavy, just heavy and still against wherever they are resting. You don't need to do anything with your body tonight. You don't need to solve anything or prepare for anything. You can let it all go for the next little while. Comfortable? Good. Then let me tell you something. Most people, when they think of Napoleon Bonaparte at all, think of one image. A short, decisive man in a grey overcoat, standing at the edge of some vast battlefield, already knowing what he is going to do about it. That is the version that history kept. That is the version that gets the paintings, the miniseries, the shelves of military biography. But tonight I want to tell you about the other version, the one that history mostly walked past. I want to tell you about a man in a garden on a small volcanic island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, turning soil with his hands. A man who reread the same novels so often that the pages grew soft. A man whose final years were among the most exhaustively documented of any human life ever lived. Every meal, every walk, every word he spoke for 6 years was written down by the people around him, and who, despite all of that, managed to remain in certain quiet ways genuinely hidden. The island was called St. Helena. The years were 1815 to 1821. And what happened there is one of those stories that deserves a much fuller telling than it usually gets. Let me take you there now. The HMS Northumberland arrived at St. Helena on the 15th of October, 1815. It was a Tuesday. The crossing had taken 10 weeks. Stand at the rail for a moment and let the scene find you. The South Atlantic in October carries a particular weight of air, dense with salt, with the particular mineral coldness that comes up from deep water, with something older underneath it, something geological, the smell of rock that has never quite dried. The island appears first as a darkness on the horizon, then as a shape, then as something that makes no sense to the eye. A mass of black and brown volcanic cliff rising straight from the ocean, almost vertical in places, with no gentle slope to ease you toward it, no beach that welcomes, no bay that offers shelter. It simply rises, abrupt, enormous in its abruptness, the kind of landfall that feels like an argument. Napoleon stood at the rail and looked at it. We know this because several witnesses recorded it. The biographer Andrew Roberts, in his exhaustive 2014 biography, Napoleon, A Life, notes that Napoleon observed the island in silence for some time before making any remark. What he said, when he finally spoke, was brief and practical. But what he thought, what it felt like to stand at that rail and watch the place where you would spend the rest of your life come toward you out of the sea, that is something the records do not fully give us. And I find that silence, that particular silence at the rail, to be one of the most genuinely moving moments in a life that contains a great many of them. I want to tell you something about St. Helena before we go any further, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because it matters for understanding what Napoleon arrived into. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the world this particular piece of volcanic rock had been moving through before Napoleon ever saw it. St. Helena sits in the South Atlantic at roughly 15 degrees south latitude, approximately 1,100 miles from the nearest significant landmass, the west coast of Africa, and 1,800 miles from South America. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. It is not large, 10.5 miles long, 6.5 miles wide, a mass of ancient basalt pushed up from the ocean floor by a volcanic hotspot over the course of millions of years. It had no indigenous human population when the Portuguese discovered it in 1502. It was, before human arrival, simply there, wind-scoured, cloud-wrapped, home to species of endemic plants and birds that had evolved in total isolation and would not survive prolonged contact with the rest of the world. And yet, by the time Napoleon arrived in 1815, St. Helena had been one of the most strategically important resupply stations on Earth for the better part of 2 centuries. The English East India Company had controlled the island since 1659, and because it sat precisely on the trade wind route between Europe and Asia, because any ship sailing from India or China around the Cape of Good Hope would, by the logic of wind and current, find itself needing exactly what St. Helena could offer, it had become something extraordinary, a small, particular, intensely inhabited society in the middle of nothing. There were gardens here. There were houses, churches, a small library, a garrison, a community of roughly 3,500 people when Napoleon arrived. There were cattle grazing on the high pasture. There were imported trees, including some that had been growing long enough to have developed genuine grandeur. There was a social world, with its own hierarchies, its own gossip, its own understanding of itself. The historian Julia Blackburn, in her book, The Emperor's Last Island, captures something of this strangeness, the way St. Helena existed as a complete world, entire in itself, receiving ships and the news of the larger world but fundamentally turned inward, fundamentally its own thing. This is what received Napoleon Bonaparte. Not empty rock, not wilderness, an established, functioning, peculiar little society that now had to absorb the most famous man on Earth and reorganize itself entirely around the fact of his presence. Back with Napoleon now, at the rail of the Northumberland. The island grows as the ship approaches. The cliffs resolve into detail, dark rock streaked with what appears, in the late afternoon light, almost orange in places, almost the color of rust. Above the cliffs, if the clouds have lifted enough, you can see green, genuine, startling green, the high interior of the island where the moisture collects and the temperature drops and the vegetation thickens into something almost lush. But from the sea, from the approach, what you see is primarily the wall, the barrier, the thing that does not invite. Napoleon was 45 years old. He had been Emperor of France, master of most of Europe, commander of armies so large that the logistics of feeding them had required essentially the reinvention of military supply chains. He had divorced one wife and married another for reasons of dynastic strategy. He had a son, a boy of 4, back in Vienna, living in the Austrian court under the name France, already being quietly reformed into someone who would never cause anyone the problems his father had, whom he would not see again. He would die on this island in 5 years and 8 months. And as the cliffs came closer and the smell of volcanic rock reached the ship, a cold smell, a mineral smell, the smell of old fire cooled and hardened, he stood at the rail and, according to the witnesses who were there, he was quiet. There is a particular quality to the quiet of someone who has understood something they had hoped not to understand. We cannot know for certain what passed through Napoleon's mind in that moment. The records hint at resignation rather than despair. The biographer Vincent Cronin noted in his careful study of Napoleon's character that one of the most consistent features of Napoleon's psychology throughout his life was an ability to accept what could not be changed with a speed that astonished those around him. Not contentment, not peace, simply acceptance, and then the immediate practical question, what is to be done with this? What was to be done with this was, for the moment, nothing. The Northumberland dropped anchor in Jamestown Bay, the only real harbour on the island, a narrow cleft in the cliff face that opens, almost surprisingly, into a small valley and a small town, and arrangements were made for the prisoner to come ashore. The 18th of October, 3 days after the first sighting. The air was cooler than Napoleon had expected, given the latitude. The wind came off the high interior of the island and carried with it something green, something damp and almost earthy, the smell of the high pasture coming down. He stepped ashore into a world he had not chosen, a world that was, in every geographical and political sense, the end of something, and the strange, genuinely strange, historically important thing, the thing this channel exists to tell you, is that what happened next, in that world, over the following years, is far more interesting than most of the histories of Napoleon bother to record. What happened next was a life, a particular, strange, stubbornly human life, lived in damp rooms and windy gardens, in long conversations and obsessive reading, and the careful cultivation of a myth that would outlast the island, the cliffs, the cold South Atlantic wind itself. What happened next is what we have come here tonight to find. The house was never meant to be comfortable. That is the first thing worth understanding about Longwood. It sat on a high plateau on the windward side of St. Helena, roughly 1,700 feet above the sea, and the wind that crossed it was a particular kind of wind, not violent, not dramatic, but constant and cold and damp in a way that no fire could quite answer. The plateau was called Deadwood Plain. The British did not choose the name for Napoleon's benefit, but they might as well have. The clouds that rolled in from the Atlantic caught on the island's volcanic ridge and stalled there, over the plateau, over the house, for days at a time. There was no escaping them. There was no higher ground to go to. The moisture settled into everything. The curtains, the upholstery, the wooden floors, the plaster of the walls. And then, eventually, into the walls themselves. Longwood House had been, before Napoleon arrived in December of 1815, a lieutenant governor's secondary residence, and, before that, a barn for livestock. It had been hastily converted. The conversion had been done quickly and without particular care, because the British government did not intend Longwood to be a palace. They intended it to be a statement. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters to what comes next. The conditions at Longwood are sometimes treated in Napoleon's biographies as a kind of background grievance, the thing he complained about, the thing Hudson Lowe wouldn't fix, the thing his loyal officers wrote indignant letters about. It becomes almost noise after a while. You read enough about the leaking roof and the damp rooms and the inadequate furniture, and you begin to wonder whether it is simply Napoleon being Napoleon, the man who had redrawn the map of Europe now reduced to complaining about a ceiling. But I think that framing misses what was actually happening. The conditions at Longwood were not accidental. They were a policy, and understanding them as a policy changes what Napoleon's response to them means. The British government, and specifically Lord Bathurst, the colonial secretary, who had effective oversight of Napoleon's captivity, had made a series of deliberate decisions about what Napoleon's life on St. Helena would and would not contain. He would have an allowance, initially £8,000 a year, later reduced, but that allowance was administered through Hudson Lowe, who controlled it with a kind of bureaucratic viciousness that the historian Andrew Roberts, in his substantial 2014 biography, describes as one of the more petty exercises of institutional power in the period. The house would be adequate but not comfortable. The grounds would be contained by a sentry line beyond which Napoleon could not pass unaccompanied. The correspondence would be monitored. The visitors would be vetted. The signal station on the hill above Longwood would watch, and the ships in the harbour would watch, and the sentries at the perimeter would watch. The intention was not merely to imprison Napoleon, it was to reduce him, to remind him, daily, through the texture of the house he lived in and the smallness of the world he was permitted, that he was no longer what he had been. Walk with me into Longwood for a moment. Push open the door, it sticks, because everything in this climate sticks, and step into the entrance hall. The air smells of mildew and damp timber, and something fainter beneath that, almost sweet, which is the smell of the green wallpaper beginning, very slowly, to deteriorate. The wallpaper is everywhere in the main rooms. It is a deep, fashionable green, the kind of green that was considered elegant in the early 19th century, a saturated botanical colour, the green of pressed leaves under glass. In good light it is almost beautiful. In the grey Atlantic light that filters through the windows of Longwood most mornings, it is merely dark. The paper has begun to peel at the corners of the rooms, where the damp is worst. There are stains on it near the ceiling in the billiard room, where the roof has let water through. Napoleon has complained about the roof. His officers have complained about the roof. Hudson Lowe has acknowledged the complaints and done very little. Let me step back from Longwood for a moment and tell you something about that green wallpaper, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because it leads somewhere that history took almost 2 centuries to fully understand. The pigment that produced that fashionable, saturated green, the green that decorated drawing rooms and dining rooms and the homes of people who considered themselves modern and tasteful across Europe and Britain in the early 19th century, was called Scheele's green. It had been developed by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele in 1775, and its chemical name was copper arsenite. It was, in other words, a pigment made from arsenic. This was not unusual at the time. Arsenic was embedded in the material culture of the 19th century in ways that would horrify us now. It was in candles. It was in fabric dyes. It was in artificial flowers. It was in wallpaper. Scheele's green was particularly beloved because it did not fade the way organic green pigments tended to. It stayed vivid. It was stable, or it appeared stable. What it was actually doing, in damp conditions, in rooms where moisture accumulated in walls and plaster, in houses where mold and fungus grew invisibly behind the paper, was producing something rather more sinister. Certain molds, when they metabolize copper arsenite, produce a volatile organorsenic compound called trimethylarsine. It is gaseous. It disperses into the air of closed rooms. It is breathed in slowly, over time, without anyone being aware of it. The hypothesis that Napoleon may have been chronically poisoned by his own wallpaper was first raised seriously in 1961 by the toxicologist Pascal Kintz, but it gained its most compelling evidence in 1982 when the researcher David Jones and the forensic chemist Kenneth Ledingham published an analysis of a lock of Napoleon's hair, a sample taken shortly after his death, and found arsenic levels approximately 13 times higher than what would be considered normal. Further analysis of hair samples from different points in Napoleon's life on St. Helena, conducted over the following decades, suggested that the arsenic exposure was not a single acute event, but a slow, cumulative accumulation. The biographer Sten Forscherfud, who was among the first to pursue this evidence seriously, argued that the levels were consistent with chronic environmental exposure rather than deliberate poisoning, though the deliberate poisoning theory has never entirely gone away, and historians continue to disagree about the relative weight of the evidence. What I find genuinely difficult to sit with, and I think about this more than I probably should, is the image it produces. Napoleon, in those last years, is already ill. He is nauseated, exhausted, experiencing pain in his right side that will eventually be understood as probable stomach cancer, possibly complicated by hepatitis. And he is sitting in his green-walled rooms by a fire that cannot fully defeat the damp, breathing air that the walls themselves are contaminating. He does not know this. No one knows this. The wallpaper looks like an aesthetic choice. It looks like a minor grace note in an otherwise graceless environment. And it may, very quietly, have been killing him. Back inside Longwood now. Back with Napoleon in those rooms. What the records show, and this is what I find genuinely moving about this particular section of his life, is that Napoleon did not accept the reduction. Not fully. Not without resistance. The historian Bernard Chevalier, who has written extensively on Napoleon's material life in exile, has noted that Napoleon spent considerable energy and a significant portion of his allowance attempting to impose some form of order and dignity on Longwood's interior. He arranged and rearranged furniture, he hung maps on the walls. He placed his own books, what he had been permitted to bring, in careful order on shelves that had been built to his specification. He set out, on his writing table, the objects that had accompanied him across Europe: the silver inkstand, the small bronze bust, the familiar weight and surface of the tools of a working mind. We cannot know exactly what it cost him, in the private accounting of a man who had slept in the Tuileries and Fontainebleau and Schönbrunn and the great imperial palaces of half a continent, to make his peace each morning with those peeling green walls and that cold, inadequate light. The biographer Alan Shom has suggested that Napoleon's need to organize his immediate environment became, in exile, something close to a daily act of will, a refusal, renewed each morning, to be entirely diminished by the place the British had chosen for him. The records hint at something in that refusal, something quiet and rather fierce. Not defiance for an audience, just a man insisting, in the smallest possible ways, on the terms of his own existence. The fire smokes a little, because the chimney draws badly in this wind. Napoleon does not look up from his papers. The garden began, as so many things on St. Helena began, with an argument about water. Longwood House sits on a plateau in the island's interior, roughly 1,700 feet above sea level, exposed to the southeast trade winds that come in off the Atlantic with a kind of personal hostility. The house is long and low, painted a damp ochre that the rain and the wind are always working to undo. The grounds around it, when Napoleon arrived in December 1815, were close to barren. A stretch of wind-scoured grass, some scrubby gorse, patches of volcanic rock breaking through the thin soil like bones. The air at Longwood is almost always damp, not the clean damp of forest or river, but something heavier, a mist that settles into clothing, into wood, into the pages of books left open too long. The smell of the place is grass and wet stone and, underneath it, something mineral and dark from the rock that lies just below everything. Napoleon looked at this ground and decided to make something of it. I want to pause here for just a moment, because I think this is where the section title earns itself. When we talk about Napoleon at St. Helena, we tend to talk about the big things, the dictation of the memoirs, the battles with Hudson Lowe over male privileges and the question of titles, the slow physical decline. And those things matter. We will get to all of them. But I find something genuinely arresting about the fact that one of the first sustained activities Napoleon threw himself into on that island was gardening. Not strategy, not correspondence with European monarchs who weren't writing back. Gardening, the making of a garden in hostile soil, on a rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. I think about this more than I probably should, what it means, what it reveals, because the man who is doing this has recently commanded the largest armies in European history. He has redesigned the legal architecture of an entire civilization. And he is here now, on this particular plateau, arguing about where to put the pond. The pond was the great project of the early garden years. Or perhaps more precisely, it was the project that revealed what the whole enterprise was going to cost. The volcanic rock at Longwood sits close to the surface everywhere, and digging down into it requires not a spade but a pick, and not a gentle pick, but the kind of sustained effort that produces blisters and a fine grey dust that settles on everything. Napoleon had to negotiate with Governor Hudson Lowe, a negotiation that was, like all negotiations between these two men, conducted in a cold mutual distaste for the labour to do the work. Eventually, a small crew was permitted. Napoleon directed operations himself, sometimes from a chair set out on the rough ground when his health was poor, sometimes on foot, walking the perimeter of the intended pond, with the particular focused attention he was known to bring to the laying out of fortifications and the planning of supply lines. The biographer Andrew Roberts, in his comprehensive 2014 Life of Napoleon, notes that Napoleon's engagement with the Longwood Garden was persistent and detailed over the course of several years, not a passing whim, but a sustained preoccupation. The sound of picks on volcanic rock is a particular sound, sharp, ringing, with a kind of stubbornness to it, as if the rock is answering back. The ground gave slowly. The men worked in the damp morning air, their breath visible, the smell of turned earth rising as they got below the rock into the dark soil beneath. Napoleon watched. He gave instructions. He changed the instructions. He watched some more. When the pond was finally dug to a depth that satisfied him, he had it lined and filled. He stocked it with fish. He had gravel brought up from the coast, a considerable effort in itself, over roads that barely deserved the name, and used it to surface the garden paths. He planted willows along the water's edge. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the history of gardens and dethroned sovereigns, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising how consistent this pattern is across time. There is a thread that runs through the history of powerful men stripped of power, and it is not, or not only, the thread of bitterness, of plotting, of desperate letter-writing to anyone who might still listen. There is another thread, quieter and stranger. Again and again, across centuries and cultures, the powerful man reduced to powerlessness turns, with something that looks very much like compulsion, to the making of a garden. Dionysius the Elder, the tyrant of Syracuse, was deposed in the 4th century BCE and spent his years of reduced circumstances. He became, famously, a schoolteacher, cultivating his property with an attention that ancient sources found both admirable and a little puzzling in a man who had commanded armies. The Emperor Charles V, who at his height ruled Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, and vast territories in the Americas, a domain that genuinely deserved the phrase on which the sun never sets, abdicated in 1556 and retired to the monastery of Yuste in Extremadura. He had perhaps 2 years of life left, and he spent them gardening. The historian William Sterling Maxwell, writing in the 19th century, described Charles at Yuste as a man who had found in the making of a garden something he had never quite located at the centre of an empire. He kept clocks too, extraordinary numbers of clocks, reportedly an obsession with getting them all to chime at the same moment, which he never achieved. But the garden he tended with a particular patience. Mary Queen of Scots, during her long English imprisonment under Elizabeth, grew flowers and herbs in whatever outdoor space her various custodians would allow her. Prisoners of state, it seems, reach for living things. The psychologist and garden historian Anne Scott James has written about what she calls the consolation of the contained, the idea that a garden offers the exiled or the imprisoned a territory that is theirs to govern, bounded and real, and responsive to their decisions in a way the wider world has ceased to be. It is control at the scale of a seed, and for someone whose loss of control over the larger world has been as total and as public as Napoleon's, there is something in that idea that lands rather heavily. The willows Napoleon planted at the pond's edge grew. They took to the damp air of Longwood in a way that little else did. The climate was genuinely hostile to most of what Napoleon attempted to cultivate. Too windy, too wet, the soil too thin above the volcanic rock. But the willows grew, and Napoleon returned to them in the quiet accounts of the household left by Emmanuel de Lascazi and the Marquise de Montholon and the others, with a consistency that feels, in retrospect, like something more than aesthetic preference. I want to be careful here, because I am about to say something that I cannot prove, and I think it is important that you know that. The records do not tell us what Napoleon was thinking when he planted the willows. They tell us that he planted them, that he tended them, that he spent time near them. What I am about to offer is not fact. It is what the biographer Gilbert Martineau, the French scholar who spent years studying the St. Helena period and served as French consul on the island, calls a temptation of the evidence. The temptation to follow what the facts suggest, even into the territory where they cannot quite reach. Napoleon's son, the boy he had named King of Rome, who was now living in Vienna under Austrian supervision, who was being slowly and methodically turned into someone else, was 4 years old when Napoleon left for St. Helena. He would never see his father again. The letters Napoleon wrote toward his son, collected in the historical record, are among the most quietly anguished documents of the entire exile. And willow, in the tradition Napoleon would have known, is the tree of mourning, the tree of absence, of things that trail in the water and cannot hold on. We cannot know, but we can sit with the image, the man in the damp air of Longwood, by the pond his own insistence pulled out of volcanic rock, watching the willows he planted move in the Atlantic wind that never, on this island, entirely stopped. The garden grew slowly, imperfectly, always against the resistance of the climate and the thin soil. But it grew. It was, in some quiet sense that perhaps only Napoleon fully understood, his. The dining room at Longwood House smelled, in the evenings, of tallow and damp. The candles were never quite enough. There was always a corner of the room that the light couldn't reach, and the wind off the South Atlantic pressed itself against the windows with a persistence that the inhabitants of that house would have stopped noticing after a year and still never quite gotten used to. The tablecloth was good linen, or had been once. The silverware was real, though modest by any standard the people using it would have previously known. And around that table, most evenings, sat 5 people who had more or less run out of things to say to one another, sitting together anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. I find this image genuinely difficult to leave alone. 5 people, a remote island in the South Atlantic, St. Helena, which sits so far from any continent that the nearest landmass is, by some reckonings, the coast of Africa, at a distance of nearly 1,200 miles. And these 5 people have been placed here, or have placed themselves here, and they are eating together in the candlelight, and the wind is doing what it always does, and nobody is saying very much at all. This is not the Napoleon history usually gives us, but I want to argue that it is, in its way, the most revealing Napoleon there is. Let me tell you who was actually in that room, because I think you'll find the specifics more interesting than the broad strokes. There was Henri Gatien Bertrand, Grand Marshal of the Palace, a man of 50 or so during the St. Helena years, an engineer by training, one of Napoleon's most technically gifted and personally loyal officers. He had served since Egypt. He had crossed half the continent with this man, and he was here now, on this island, because loyalty was simply the organizing principle of his life, and he did not know how to be otherwise. There was his wife, Fanny Bertrand, Countess Bertrand, who had not chosen this with the same full-throated conviction her husband had, the biographer and historian Andrew Roberts, whose 2014 biography, Napoleon, A Life, draws on a remarkable breadth of primary sources, notes that Fanny Bertrand suffered profoundly on St. Helena, that she was vivacious and social, and had been, in Paris, a figure of some brilliance in society. She was not designed, by temperament or by desire, for a remote island. She had attempted, at the moment of departure, to refuse to go. There are accounts, varying in their details, of a dramatic scene aboard the ship. Northumberland. She went anyway. She was there now, at this table, in this light, with her husband's quiet and absolute decision surrounding her like weather. There were the children. The Bertrands brought 3 children to St. Helena, which is one of those facts that lands differently the more you sit with it. Henri and Fanny, Hortense and the youngest, Arthur, who was born on the island itself in 1817, meaning that this child's first understanding of what the world looked, smelled and sounded like was salt wind, volcanic rock, and candlelight in a damp house at the edge of everything. And then there were the Montholons, Charles Tristan de Montholon and his wife Albine, whose presence on St. Helena has been the subject of considerable historical scrutiny over the years, because Montholon was not, by most accounts, among Napoleon's most trusted or closest companions before the exile. He was ambitious in the particular way of men who are not quite as capable as they believe themselves to be. Why was he here? Historians have debated this with some energy. Some have speculated about the nature of Albine's relationship with Napoleon, which the historical record leaves, as these things often do, suggestive but unconfirmed. Others have noted, more coldly, that Montholon was one of the primary suspects in later theories about Napoleon's arsenic poisoning, a theory that remains contested, based in part on analyses of Napoleon's preserved hair showing elevated arsenic levels, though the interpretation of that evidence is far from settled. I am not going to resolve any of that tonight. What I want you to notice is simply this. Even the question of who was in that room carries its own particular weight. These were not straightforwardly loyal people gathered in comfortable solidarity. They were complicated, motivated by different things, carrying different griefs, managing different private calculations, and they were all stuck. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the particular kind of social formation that an exile household represents, because I think it illuminates what was happening at Longwood in ways that are genuinely surprising. There is a long history, in European political life, of the court in exile, the household that reconstructs the rituals and hierarchies of real power in the absence of that power. The most famous English example is the Stuart court at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where James II retreated after 1688, and where his successors maintained for decades a court of extraordinary formal complexity. Titles were granted, ceremonies were observed, precedence was kept, all in a French chateau, sustained by French generosity, in relation to a throne that was no longer theirs. Historians of the Jacobite exile, including Edward Corp, who has written extensively on the subject, have noted how the rituals of the court simultaneously consoled and tormented those who maintained them. The ritual said, "We are still what we were." The ritual also said, every single day, by the very fact of its performance in exile, we are not what we were. The comfort and the wound were the same gesture. Longwood was something similar, compressed and made more intense by the island's isolation and by Napoleon's particular genius for making everything about himself. He insisted on ceremony. He insisted on being addressed correctly, dressed for dinner, treated with the protocols of the imperial court. Governor Hudson Lowe's refusal to refer to him as anything other than General Bonaparte, denying the imperial title, was not a petty bureaucratic squabble. It was a genuine assault on the only architecture that still made sense of these people's lives. The household kept the forms alive because the forms were all that remained. But forms, maintained long enough without substance, begin to do something strange to the people maintaining them. They become a kind of shared performance that everyone knows is a performance and that no one can break first. The silverware is set correctly. The conversation is addressed to the emperor, and somewhere behind all of it, 5 adults and several children are simply people on an island, waiting for something, though they might not have been able to say, honestly, what. Back with our household now, and with Henri Bertrand specifically, because there is something in his particular situation that the records preserve, and that I find genuinely moving. The biographer and historian Michael Broers in his work on Napoleon, has noted that Bertrand was, in many ways, the most quietly heroic figure of the entire St. Helena period. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the ordinary, grinding, daily sense of heroism that rarely gets celebrated because it is not spectacular. He stayed. He managed the household. He dealt with Governor Lowe's restrictions and indignities on Napoleon's behalf. He watched his wife suffer and did not leave. He watched his children grow up on volcanic rock under Atlantic sky. And he stayed because the man in that house was the man he had chosen to serve, and Henri Bertrand was not, at his core, a man who unchose. We cannot know exactly what that cost him. The records suggest it cost something real. His own journals from the period, less famous than Las Cases's. Memorial. Less scandalous than Gourgaud's private diary, have a quality of careful, muted endurance. Not self-pity, not complaint, something quieter and harder than either. The daily notation of a life being lived in service to something that was, in the world's eyes, finished. It is tempting to imagine him in the evenings, after the table was cleared and the candles were guttering low, listening to the wind that never stopped, aware of his wife's unhappiness in the way that long-married people are aware of each other's unhappiness, as a kind of atmospheric pressure rather than a specific complaint, and simply continuing, simply being there, because he had decided to be there, and Henri Bertrand was the kind of man who meant what he decided. The wind pressed on the windows, the candles shortened, and around that table 5 people sat in the particular silence of those who have shared everything and have, by now, said almost all of it. The journal is small. That is the first thing worth knowing. Not a grand folio, not the kind of bound volume you imagine when you imagine history being written. Gaspard Gourgaud's private record of the St. Helena years is a close-written, cramped, particular document. The kind of thing a man produces when he is writing for himself, and not for posterity, when the pressure of what he is feeling is greater than the space available to contain it. The ink varies, darker in some passages, as if pressed harder, as if the pen were a tool for releasing something rather than simply recording it, lighter in others, the hand moving quickly, almost carelessly, as if he wanted to get the thought down before the feeling passed, or before he thought better of it. I find this detail, the varying darkness of the ink, genuinely moving, not because it is dramatic, because it is the opposite of dramatic. It is the trace of a human being writing in private, in real time, at different hours, in different emotional temperatures, not knowing that 2 centuries later, someone would try to read the pressure behind each sentence. Let me tell you what Gourgaud's journal is, and why I think it matters more than almost any other document produced on St. Helena. Because it does matter. And I think the reason it matters has been quietly overlooked in the larger biographical tradition, which has tended to focus on the Mémorial de Sainte-Hélène, Las Cases' long, carefully curated account, as the definitive text of the exile. The memorial is important, but it was written to be important. Gourgaud's journal was written because he was lonely and furious and in love with a man who didn't know what to do with him, and it shows. Gaspard Gourgaud was 29 years old when he chose to follow Napoleon into exile on St. Helena in 1815. He was a soldier, a distinguished one, an artillery officer who had served Napoleon with genuine distinction across multiple campaigns. He had, by various accounts, saved Napoleon's life at least once at Brienne in 1814, stepping between the emperor and a Cossack lance, and this act of personal devotion had created in Gourgaud something complicated and difficult, a sense of claim. He had given Napoleon his life, or something close to it, and he seems to have expected, not unreasonably, that Napoleon would understand the magnitude of that gift, that he would treat Gourgaud with particular tenderness, that there would be a special place at the table, an acknowledgement, a reciprocal intimacy. Napoleon, being Napoleon, did not quite deliver this. The household at Longwood, the low, damp, wind-battered house on the central plateau of the island, was small enough that personal dynamics had nowhere to dissipate. The smell of the place is documented in multiple accounts. The dampness that never fully left the walls, the mildew in the curtains, the coal smoke from fires that burned to combat a cold that was never quite cold enough to justify them, the particular staleness of rooms where the same small group of people ate and slept and argued and read for years without real variation. It was, the biographer Andrew Roberts has noted, a kind of prolonged forced intimacy that would have tested any set of personalities, let alone personalities as charged and compressed as the ones Napoleon had gathered around him. In this environment, Gourgaud wrote. He wrote about Napoleon's moods, the sudden warmth, the sudden coldness, the way Napoleon would invite Gourgaud for a walk in the garden and talk with apparent openness for an hour, and then ignore him entirely for 3 days. He wrote about his own jealousy, particularly of Las Cases, and later of the Montholon family, who seemed to occupy a proximity to Napoleon that Gourgaud felt was rightfully his. The historian Peter Guile, in his famous assessment of the Napoleonic legend, drew attention to the way Gourgaud's journal captures a Napoleon that no official account could afford to contain. Irritable, petty at moments, capable of deliberate cruelty to those closest to him, but also, and this is the part I think deserves equal weight, unexpectedly funny, unexpectedly tender, unexpectedly human, in the way that only people who are no longer performing for history can be. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about this tradition of private records, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising. Some of the most important historical documents in existence were never meant to be read. Samuel Pepys's diary, written in a personal shorthand cipher, recorded the intimate texture of Restoration London, the smell of plague, the sound of the Great Fire, the particular feeling of a city coming apart and reassembling itself, with a frankness that Pepys clearly never intended for public eyes. He saw things no official record acknowledged, and felt things no statesman would have admitted. Louis de Rouvroy, the Duke of Saint-Simon, kept his great memoir of the court of Louis XIV for decades in private, filling it with observations about power and vanity and the small cruelties of Versailles that the official history of the Sun King's reign had carefully erased. What these documents share is not neutrality. Pepys was vain, Saint-Simon was bitter, Gourgaud was jealous, but rather the quality of unguardedness. They were not managing an impression, and that unguardedness is precisely what makes them irreplaceable. History's most honest witnesses, it turns out, are almost never the ones history intended to call. Back with Gourgaud on St. Helena, where the wind comes off the Atlantic with a particular force in the evenings, bending the gum trees planted around Longwood in a permanent lean, and where the sound of the house settling in the night, the groaning of damp timber, the rattle of an ill-fitting window, was the sound that accompanied most of his writing hours. What Gourgaud recorded, specifically, was this: Napoleon contradicting himself, repeatedly and sometimes spectacularly. The image Napoleon was carefully constructing for Las Cases, the liberal reformer, the man of peace forced into war by the aggression of monarchies who feared him, the protector of the revolution's principles, sat uneasily against what Gourgaud heard Napoleon say in unguarded moments. Napoleon admitted to Gourgaud, on at least one documented occasion, that he had not always been driven by the principles he was now claiming as his legacy. That ambition had been its own force, that the wars had not always been defensive. These admissions are not consistent with the memorial, and historians have long noted the discrepancy. The biographer Frank McLynn, in his substantial 1997 biography, argues that Gourgaud's journal gives us something the memorial deliberately withholds, Napoleon thinking aloud rather than performing for the record. This is what I find myself returning to, in the quiet of thinking about these years, the difference between a man thinking aloud and a man performing for the record. Most of Napoleon's life was performance, necessarily, brilliantly, breathtakingly so. But on St. Helena, In the hours between the formal dictation sessions with Las Cases and the long damp afternoons with nothing particular to do, something less managed occasionally surfaced. And Gorgo was there, writing it down, in ink that varies in darkness depending on the hour and the feeling. The painful irony, and I want to sit with this for a moment because I think it deserves it, is that Gorgo himself was in genuine emotional crisis during these years. The biographer Martineau, in his careful study of the St. Helena household, documents what can only be described as a kind of breakdown. Gorgo increasingly jealous, increasingly depressed, increasingly desperate for a recognition from Napoleon that was not forthcoming. He would eventually leave St. Helena in 1818, departing in distress. And Napoleon, it appears, let him go without fully understanding what he was losing. What he was losing was his most honest witness, the man who loved him enough to stay and who was honest enough in his private pages not to make that love into flattery. The journal survived because it was never meant for publication. It is, in that sense, the hidden text of the exile, the document underneath the document, the voice that recorded Napoleon as he actually was, rather than as he intended to be remembered. And reading it, really sitting with it, changes something. Not in who Napoleon was publicly, but in who he was in the damp rooms at Longwood, in the evening, when the wind was coming in off the water, and no one was watching, except the young man with the pen and the varying darkness of the ink. There is a portrait. It sat on the mantelpiece at Longwood House, that damp, wind-battered residence the British had assigned to their most famous prisoner, and Napoleon returned to it with a regularity that the members of his small household came to recognize as something private and unspoken. It was a portrait of his son, the boy he called his son, in the way that a man uses a word to hold something he cannot otherwise contain. The King of Rome, born in 1811, the child of Napoleon and his second empress, Marie Louise of Austria, named with imperial ambition before he had drawn his second breath. And by 1815, when Napoleon sailed towards St. Helena under British escort, that boy was 4 years old, had been taken to Vienna, and would never, not once, not for a single afternoon, be allowed to visit his father again. I find this detail genuinely difficult to move past quickly, and I do not want to move past it quickly, because I think it is one of those losses, the kind that does not announce itself loudly in the historical record, but simply sits there, in the middle of the story, waiting for someone to look at it directly. The portrait was positioned on the mantelpiece in Napoleon's study at Longwood, or in the salon adjacent to it, depending on which account you consult. And the accounts are numerous because Napoleon's household kept meticulous records of almost everything. What is consistent across multiple testimonies is this: the portrait was there, it was visible from where Napoleon habitually sat, and he looked at it. The mornings on St. Helena arrived with a particular quality of light. The island sits in the South Atlantic, roughly 1,100 miles from the coast of Africa, and the light there, especially in the early hours before the clouds gathered, which they did almost daily at Longwood's elevation, was clear and flat and somehow shadowless, in a way that made distances hard to judge. It fell through the windows of Longwood, in pale rectangles. It touched the mantelpiece. It touched the portrait. Count Emmanuel de Las Cases, who served as Napoleon's secretary and companion during the first years of exile, and whose Memorial de Sainte-Hélène remains one of the foundational documents of those years, recorded that Napoleon spoke of his son often, not always at length, not always with visible emotion, but often. He asked about the boy's health. He asked about his education. He spoke of what he imagined the child might be learning, what he hoped for him, what kind of man he might become. The child he was describing, by this point, he had not seen in years. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the world that boy was moving through, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because understanding it changes the weight of what Napoleon was asking about across 1,100 miles of ocean. When Napoleon fell in 1815, his son was taken to the Austrian court in Vienna, to be raised under the supervision of his maternal grandfather, the Emperor Francis I of Austria. He was given a new name, or rather, his name was quietly suppressed. He was called Franz, the Duke of Reichstadt, not Napoleon. Not the King of Rome, the Austrians understood, with the particular clarity of dynastic calculation, that a name is also a weapon, and they kept this one locked in a drawer. The historian Alan Forrest, writing on the Napoleonic legacy, has noted how deliberate and thoroughgoing this management was. The boy was kept at a respectful distance from his own inheritance, educated at the Austrian court, dressed in Austrian uniforms, trained to think of himself as a Habsburg prince rather than a Bonaparte heir. He was watched, he was managed, he was, in the most precise sense, contained. He grew up intelligent, apparently striking in appearance, subject to a chest condition, tuberculosis, it would eventually become clear, that would kill him before he reached 22. He died in 1832 at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, aged 21. He had never, not once in his adult life, been permitted to act on his own name or his own history. Napoleon II, as history sometimes calls him, though he was never permitted to use the title publicly, lived exactly the kind of life that the people who feared him most had designed for him. Brief, contained, and ultimately harmless to everyone except himself. Napoleon on St. Helena did not know his son would die young. But he knew, or came to know, gradually, through the careful silences of the letters that reached him and those that didn't, that the boy was being shaped away from him, that someone was, very deliberately, building a different person out of the child he had named with so much intention. The letters Napoleon wrote to his son were, in most accounts, not delivered. Some were intercepted. Some never left the island. The mechanics of their suppression varied, but the outcome was consistent. The boy in Vienna did not receive his father's words, and the man on St. Helena does not appear to have known with any certainty whether anything he wrote got through. The biographer Vincent Cronin, in his Life of Napoleon, notes that Napoleon continued writing anyway. This is the detail I keep returning to. He wrote letters he had reason to believe would not arrive. He composed them with care. The historical record preserves at least some of their content, some of their tenderness, and sent them into a system he had every reason to distrust. We cannot know what Napoleon felt when he sat down to write those letters, but it is tempting to imagine, and I think the imagination is not dishonest here, because it is grounded in documented behavior, that the writing itself was the point. That a letter written is not nothing, even when it is not read. That there is a particular kind of love which does not require a recipient to be real, which needs only to be expressed. He asked, through the members of his household who had channels of communication he did not, about the boy's appetite, about whether he was learning to ride, about his health, always his health. General Henri Gatien Bertrand, Napoleon's Grand Marshal, and one of the small number of companions who remained with him until the end, recorded these conversations. They appear in Bertrand's notebooks, the Cahiers de Sainte-Hélène, in brief, matter-of-fact entries that somehow hurt more for their brevity. Napoleon asked. Napoleon listened to whatever answer could be assembled from incomplete information. Napoleon asked again, "I want to be honest with you about something. The heroic version of Napoleon, the version that fills most of the available space in our imagination of him, does not have much room for this. The heroic version is about Austerlitz and the civil code, and the coronation, and the 100 days. It is about a man who moved through history like a force of nature, who reshaped borders and legal systems, and the way Europeans thought about themselves. That man and this man, the man asking about a child's appetite from 1,100 miles away, looking at a portrait in morning light, writing letters into silence, are the same person. And I think understanding that they are the same person is genuinely important, not because it diminishes the first version, but because the second version tells us something the first version cannot. What St. Helena cost Napoleon was not his freedom alone, though it cost him that. It was not his power, though it cost him that too. What it cost him, quietly, in the mornings with the light on the portrait and the letter half written on the desk, was the ordinary future, the future in which a father watches a son grow, asks questions and receives answers, sits in the same room, hears the breathing. Napoleon died in May 1821. His will, which he composed with the same systematic attention he had brought to the organization of armies, contained specific bequests for his son, items chosen with care. The kind of care a person brings to choosing things for someone they do not expect to see again, but cannot stop thinking of anyway. The portrait stayed on the mantelpiece until the end. The library at Longwood House did not arrive all at once. This is the first thing worth understanding, that the books came in slowly, shipped from Paris and London and Lisbon, requested by letter, sometimes arriving months after the request was made, sometimes not arriving at all. In the early years of the exile, Napoleon read what he had brought with him and what he could borrow from members of the household, and the shelves of the long damp room at Longwood were never quite full enough. By the end, though, by the last 2 or 3 years, somewhere in the region of 3,000 volumes had been assembled there. 3,000 books on an island in the South Atlantic, in a house that leaked when it rained, surrounded by British soldiers posted to watch the perimeter. The historian Andrew Roberts, in his comprehensive biography, Napoleon the Great, notes that Napoleon's library at Longwood was in fact one of the largest private collections on the island by some distance, which tells you something about the island. But it tells you something about Napoleon too. I find this detail genuinely hard to get out of my head. 3,000 books on St. Helena, in a house the man hated, in a climate that was playing havoc with his health, under the watch of a governor he despised. He still wanted the books. He still, in some fundamental way, needed them. The narrator returns to that library now. It is a morning in, let us say, 1819, 2 years before the end. The fire in the study at Longwood has been burning since before dawn, but the room is still cold at the edges, the way stone rooms always are in the damp South Atlantic winter. The smell is particular: old leather bindings, paper with a faint mildew edge from the climate, wood smoke, and underneath everything the island's perpetual scent of wet earth and salt. Napoleon is not at his desk. He is in the bath. This was a genuine and documented habit, one of the more quietly human details of the St. Helena years. Napoleon had always been an unusually frequent bather by the standards of his era, and at Longwood, the bath became something close to a ritual. He would soak for long periods, sometimes an hour or more, the water kept as hot as could be managed, and he would read. A book held above the waterline, the steam rising around him, the window small and usually grey with cloud. General Gourgaud, whose diary from these years is one of the primary sources for the private Napoleon of St. Helena, noted the habit with something between exasperation and affection. Napoleon reading in the bath was simply Napoleon, ordinary, absorbed, almost unreachable. What he was reading, in those years, matters. He read history compulsively, and always had: Thucydides, Livy, Gibbons. Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which he had read multiple times, and which he annotated with the attention of a man who felt personally implicated in every question about how empires rise and fall and why. He read military commentaries, sometimes dictating his own responses aloud to his secretary, interrupting a general's account of a campaign to correct it in the margins of the air. He read Corneille and Racine. He read Voltaire, whom he found brilliant and irritating in roughly equal measure, according to the recollections of Las Cases in the Memorial de Sainte-Hélène. He read English history with a focused, almost clinical attention, particularly histories of Cromwell and the English Civil War, which the biographer Andrew Roberts suggests held for Napoleon a kind of dark mirror quality, a meditation on what becomes of great men who reshape nations without being able to secure what comes after. But there is one particular thread in Napoleon's reading life at Longwood that I keep returning to, and I want to take a moment here to tell you about it properly, because I think it is genuinely surprising, and because it connects to something in these final years that the heroic narrative of Napoleon's life has almost no category for. Let me tell you about the Ossian poems, because there is something here I have been saving. James Macpherson was a Scottish poet and scholar who, beginning in 1760, published a series of epic poems he claimed to have translated from ancient Gaelic manuscripts, the works of a 3rd-century bard named Ossian, son of Fingal, who had composed these vast, melancholy songs of a lost heroic world before the light of that world went out entirely. The poems were immediately extraordinarily successful. They swept across Europe. They helped ignite the Romantic movement. They offered readers something that felt ancient and authentic, the bones of a civilization long buried, these elegies for greatness that had passed. They were, at least in substantial part, a fabrication. Macpherson had drawn on genuine fragments of Gaelic oral tradition, but he had invented freely, elaborated extensively, and created in effect a beautiful literary forgery. A myth of origins that the Romantic movement needed, and so, in some sense, called into being. Samuel Johnson was famously contemptuous and suspicious almost immediately. The scholars followed. By the early 19th century, the question of Ossian's authenticity had been largely settled. Macpherson had invented most of it. The ancient bard did not exist in the form the poems claimed. Napoleon had loved the Ossian poems since his youth in Corsica. He carried them on campaigns. He commissioned paintings inspired by them. He named one of his ships for them. The biographer Adam Zamoyski, in his account of Napoleon's early formation, notes that the young Bonaparte's emotional landscape was significantly shaped by Ossian's particular flavour of heroic melancholy. Great men striding through mist and darkness, their glory destined to be remembered long after they were gone. This was the poetry that Napoleon had grown up with, had internalized, had in some sense built his self-mythology around. And on St. Helena he returned to it. Here is the thing that I find genuinely moving, and I want to be careful about how I say it, because I am inferring something that the historical record can only hint at rather than confirm. By the time Napoleon was reading Ossian in the library at Longwood, he almost certainly knew, or strongly suspected, that the poems were not what Macpherson had claimed. The debate had been public for decades, but he read them anyway. He kept them on his shelves. He returned to them. There is something in that particular fact worth sitting with. A man who was himself engaged consciously and deliberately in the construction of his own legend, as we will explore in the next section of this story, finding comfort and kinship in poems that were themselves a constructed legend, a beautiful fiction about lost heroic grandeur, the forgery reading the forgery, or perhaps something more generous than that. A man who understood, from the inside, that the stories we tell about greatness are always partly invented, always partly myth, and who found in Ossian's fabricated grief for a vanished world something that rhymed, quietly and perhaps painfully, with his own situation. Back to that library now, back to that bath and the cold edges of that damp room and the books on their shelves. We cannot know what Napoleon was thinking in those hours. The records, Gourgaud's diary, Bertrand's notebooks, the account of Marchand the valet, who was closer to Napoleon in those years than almost anyone, tell us what he said, what he ate, what he complained about, how he slept. They are less good at telling us what he felt in the quiet of his own interior. The biographer Vincent Cronin has suggested that there was a searching quality to Napoleon's intellectual life at Longwood, that the confident, constructed voice of the memorial deliberately obscures a man genuinely uncertain, genuinely turning questions over, genuinely looking to history and to literature for some kind of answer to the question of whether what he had done had mattered, and how it would be remembered, and whether those were even the same question. Plutarch was on those shelves, Homer was on those shelves, Gibbon and Livy, and the fabricated Ossian, and the precise minutes of the English Civil War. 3,000 volumes in a leaking house on an island at the end of the world. A man in a bath, water cooling around him, holding a book above the surface with a hand that had once signed treaties that redrew the map of Europe. Let the image rest there for a moment. There is no need to rush past it. There is a particular kind of performance that happens when a person knows they are being watched by history. Not by a crowd, not by a court, not by an army, but by time itself, by the long, slow, indifferent judgment of centuries. Most of us never have to reckon with that kind of audience. Napoleon Bonaparte, sitting in the low candle-lit rooms of Longwood House on St. Helena, reckoned with nothing else. The evenings at Longwood had a rhythm to them. Dinner, which Napoleon took early by the standards of the age, sometimes as early as 6 in the evening, and then the withdrawal into the small drawing room, or the study, where the candles were lit against the Atlantic dark, and the wind came off the water with a particular persistence, finding every gap in the walls, making the flames lean and recover, lean and recover. Emmanuel de las Cases would settle at his writing table. He was a small, precise man, meticulous in his habits, with a scholar's instinct for the weight of what he was recording. His quill moved across the page with a scratching that was almost the only sound in the room, beyond the wind and the distant breathing of the house settling around them. Napoleon would pace. He was always pacing in those years, across the same floors, past the same furniture, wearing the same roots into the boards beneath his feet. And as he paced, he talked. He chose his words with the particular care of a man who knows, with absolute clarity, that he is not speaking for the room. He was speaking for the century, for the next century, for all of them, if he could arrange it. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think this is where this particular chapter of Napoleon's story gets genuinely strange and genuinely worth sitting with. What Napoleon was doing in those evening sessions with Las Cases was not simply recording what had happened. He was constructing what had happened. He was editing, shaping, selecting, deciding which version of himself would survive the island. The Mémorial de Sainte-Hélène, which Las Cases assembled from these sessions and eventually published in 1823, 2 years after Napoleon's death, is one of the most important books of the 19th century. But it is also, and Napoleon knew this, a piece of political theatre, the most carefully staged piece of political theatre he ever produced. And he produced it from a room barely larger than a generous bedroom, on an island in the South Atlantic, while his health was failing and the world he had made was already being unmade without him. I find that genuinely extraordinary. The memorial took shape across roughly 18 months of those evening sessions before Las Cases himself was expelled from St. Helena by Governor Hudson Lowe in December 1816. Expelled, ironically, for attempting to smuggle Napoleon's letters off the island, which was precisely the kind of act the legend required. Las Cases left with his notes. He carried them to Europe like relics. Napoleon, watching him go, understood that the vessel of the narrative was departing, and that what remained was the waiting. But the project was already well advanced by then. Napoleon had given Las Cases something extraordinary, a full account, rendered in the language of retrospective grandeur, of the campaigns, the decisions, the philosophy of power, the vision of European unity that he had, in his own telling, always been working toward. The wars became the instruments of civilization. The defeats became the fault of circumstance, of betrayal, of the limitations of others. The continental system, the Spanish catastrophe, the Russian winter, these were reframed, not denied, but placed within a larger story in which Napoleon remained the protagonist of human progress, temporarily interrupted. The candle flame guttered, Las Cases wrote. Napoleon chose the next sentence. Let me tell you about the publication history of the memorial, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising how much that one book did. When Las Cases published it in Paris in 1823, it sold in extraordinary numbers. By the standards of the era it was, The historian Sudhir Hazarisingh has noted, one of the best-selling books of the entire century in France. 8 volumes, dense with Napoleon's recollections and Lascases' framing commentary, and people bought them as fast as the presses could produce them. The Memorial was read by factory workers and by poets. Victor Hugo read it. Alfred de Musset read it. The whole of the Romantic generation in France absorbed it, and what they found there, the solitary genius, betrayed by small men and bad luck, burning with a vision the world was not ready for, became one of the foundational myths of Romanticism itself. And then, extraordinarily, it became political. The Memorial, his image of Napoleon as a man of the people, a child of the revolution who had carried its principles across Europe at the point of a sword, laid the ideological groundwork for something Napoleon himself could not have predicted: the political career of his nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who rode the Napoleonic legend to the presidency of France in 1848, and then to the throne as Napoleon III in 1852. A book dictated in a small damp room on a South Atlantic island by a man under house arrest shaped the government of France 3 decades after his death. Let me take you back now to the room itself, to the evenings, to the scratch of the quill and the pacing footsteps, because I think the private story is even more interesting than the public one. What the Memorial did not contain, could not contain, was the Napoleon that General Gaspard Gourgaud recorded in his private journal, kept during the same years with a very different intention. Gourgaud was not Lascases. He was a soldier, emotionally volatile, devoted to Napoleon with the intensity of a man who has made another person the entire meaning of his life, and correspondingly prone to misery when that devotion was not returned in kind. His journal was not written for publication. It was written for himself, in the half-dark of St. Helena, with the ink of genuine bewilderment, and what it shows is a Napoleon who sometimes, in unguarded moments, laughed at his own performance. The historian Peter Guile, in his remarkable study, Napoleon, For and Against, noted that the private Napoleon of the Gourgaud journals and the published Napoleon of the Memorial are often in direct tension, that Napoleon said things in his pacing, off-the-record hours that would have dismantled the legend he was building in his recorded ones. He contradicted himself about Josephine. He contradicted himself about the Russian campaign. He was sometimes petty, sometimes vain, sometimes frightened in ways the Memorial's Napoleon never could be. And occasionally, this is the detail that has stayed with me, Gourgaud recorded Napoleon catching himself in the performance, pausing mid-sentence, acknowledging, with something that reads as wry self-awareness rather than regret, that what he was saying for the record was not quite what he believed in the dark. The biographer Andrew Roberts, in his 2014 biography, Napoleon, A Life, observed that Napoleon retained to the end a clear-eyed understanding of the gap between the historical figure he was constructing and the man who woke each morning to the same damp walls and the same Atlantic wind. I think about what that doubling must have cost him. Not morally. Napoleon was not a man who suffered greatly from moral scruple about the management of his own image, but humanly. The loneliness of performing for centuries when the person you most want to talk to is a child in Vienna you will never see again. The records suggest, and this runs through Bertrand's journals particularly, that in the moments between the dictation sessions, in the early mornings before the household was properly awake, something quieter moved through Napoleon than the Memorial ever recorded. Not despair exactly, not surrender, but something in the neighborhood of a man who knows the difference between the story he is telling and the life he is living, and has decided, with great deliberateness, that the story is what matters now. The candle burned lower. Lascases' quill moved across the page. The wind found the gap in the window frame, and the flame leaned sideways, casting Napoleon's shadow, long and uncertain, across the wall behind him. He was still choosing the next sentence. He was always choosing the next sentence. Outside, the island breathed in the dark. The same island, indifferent to emperors, that would hold him for 5 more years. And inside the small lit room, the legend continued its patient, deliberate construction, word by careful word, for an audience that had not yet been born. The meetings happened in a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of two men who had simply run out of things to say. This was the silence of a room where both men understood, with complete clarity, that they despised each other and were required, by protocol and politics and the watching eyes of history, to behave as though they did not. Sir Hudson Lowe would arrive at Longwood House in his uniform, stiff and buttoned to the throat even in the damp St. Helena heat, and Napoleon would receive him in whatever room he had chosen, and they would sit at a distance from each other that was just slightly too large to be comfortable, and the silence would fall between them like a third presence, something heavy, with weight to it, pressing down on the chairs and the floorboards and the tepid afternoon air. Napoleon, by multiple accounts, would study Lowe's face during these meetings with the focused, almost clinical attention of a man who found his enemy genuinely interesting, not warmly interesting, not with any softness in it. The way a naturalist might study an unfamiliar specimen, with a kind of detached and professional curiosity. General Gaspard Gourgaud, one of the small household who accompanied Napoleon to St. Helena, left detailed observations of these encounters. The biographer Andrew Roberts, in his 2014 Life of Napoleon, draws carefully on the memoirs and diaries of the St. Helena household, and what emerges from that material is a portrait of these meetings that the popular account, Lowe as cartoonish jailer, Napoleon as dignified martyr, almost entirely flattens. I want to be honest with you about something here, because I think this particular dynamic is one of the most genuinely psychologically interesting things in all of the St. Helena years, and it tends to get reduced to something much simpler than it actually was. The story we usually tell is clean. Lowe the villain, Napoleon the prisoner, the petty restrictions, the humiliation, the reduction of a great man by a small one. And that story is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. Let me tell you something about Hudson Lowe before he ever set foot on St. Helena, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising. Lowe was not a fool. He was not a monster. He was not a particularly cruel man by the standards of his time or his profession. He was, in fact, a reasonably competent military officer who had served in various capacities across the Napoleonic Wars, including as a liaison officer to the Prussian and Austrian forces, a role that required a certain diplomatic intelligence. He had commanded the Corsican Rangers, a unit that fought for Britain, and that included, with a particular irony that history seems to enjoy arranging, a number of men who had been Napoleon's own compatriots before the political winds shifted. He spoke several languages. He was methodical and thorough. He was, by any ordinary measure, a man who deserved a solid career and an unremarkable retirement and a modest footnote in the military histories of his era. And then he was given the St. Helena appointment. The historian David Chandler once observed that Lowe's selection for the governorship was driven less by any obvious fitness for the role than by a combination of his availability, his multilingualism, and the particular desire of the British government to find someone sufficiently senior to manage what they understood was a historically significant containment, but sufficiently obscure that his appointment would not itself become a diplomatic event. He was, in other words, chosen partly for his adequacy. What no one considered, or perhaps did not consider carefully enough, is what it would do to a man of adequate qualities to be placed in daily proximity with Napoleon Bonaparte. There is a particular cruelty in certain legacies. Lowe's entire subsequent existence in historical memory, his entire claim on the attention of any future reader, would be defined by this single appointment. He would not be remembered for the Corsican Rangers, or for his years of competent service, or for anything that came before or after. He would be remembered as Napoleon's jailer. His name would survive history as a footnote in someone else's story. And Napoleon, with the psychological precision that he brought to almost everything, understood this, understood it early, understood it clearly, and, the evidence strongly suggests, used it. Back to those meetings now. Back to the stiff chairs and the heavy silence and Napoleon's watching eyes. The records of the St. Helena years are, paradoxically, almost overwhelmingly dense. Las Cases kept his memorial, Gourgaud kept his diary, Henri Gratien Bertrand kept his. Dr. Barry O'Meara, Napoleon's Irish physician, kept notes that he would later publish under the title Napoleon in Exile, and which caused a considerable political scandal. From all of this material, from the overlapping and sometimes contradictory testimony of the small household trapped on that rain-soaked island with Napoleon, a picture of the Lowe relationship emerges that is more complicated and more human than the legend allows. Lowe was afraid. This is the part the popular story tends to leave out. Not afraid of Napoleon escaping, though that fear was real and officially sanctioned, and the justification for most of the restrictions he imposed. Afraid of something quieter and more personal. The historian Michael John, writing on the administration of St. Helena, has argued that Lowe's rigidity, his insistence on protocols that often served no practical security purpose, his refusal of small concessions that would have cost Britain nothing and improved conditions meaningfully, reflected something closer to anxiety than malice. The anxiety of a man who knew that whatever he did would be scrutinized, that every decision would be measured against the enormous weight of who his prisoner was, that a single mistake, a softening, a misread gesture, an error of judgment, could end his career and brand him in the history books as the man who let Napoleon escape, or the man who let Napoleon die of neglect, or simply the man who got it wrong. We cannot know what Hudson Lowe felt in the private hours. The records hint at a man who wrote endless reports to London, who justified his smallest decisions in exhaustive bureaucratic prose, who seemed to require the reassurance of procedure in a situation that procedure could never fully contain. I find something in that genuinely sad. Not sympathetic, exactly. His restrictions were real, and often petty, and they did cause Napoleon genuine suffering. But sad, the portrait of a man who had been handed a role that was too large for him, and who responded by making the role smaller, more manageable, more procedural, until the procedure itself became the thing he was protecting. Napoleon understood this. Gourgaud's diary records Napoleon describing Lowe with a contempt so specific it reads almost as admiration, the precision of an opponent's weakness, identified and catalogued. He noted Lowe's nervousness, his tendency to over-explain, his visible discomfort when Napoleon moved the conversation to terrain Lowe hadn't prepared for. These observations were not simply complaint. They had the quality of professional assessment. Napoleon was mapping a terrain. The last of the formal meetings between them occurred in 1818, after which Napoleon refused to see Lowe again, receiving him only through intermediaries. It was, in its way, the final strategic move of a military career, the withdrawal of acknowledgement as a statement of power, and it worked, in the only way that still mattered. It worked on history. Lowe would spend the years after Napoleon's death writing defensive memoirs and petitioning for recognition that never fully came, defined to the end by the man he had been tasked to contain, and had, in almost every way that counted, failed to diminish. The silence between them, in those stiff-chaired meetings, still carries weight. Two men trapped in roles neither had chosen, each making the other worse. The damp island air pressing down on everything, the sound of wind off the Atlantic coming through the imperfectly sealed windows of Longwood, and Napoleon watching, always watching, finding, even here, even in this, something genuinely interesting to study. The bath came first. Before the physicians arrived with their consultations and their cautious faces, before the household arranged itself around the morning's particular difficulties, before any of the routines of Longwood could begin, Napoleon went to the bath. He had always been fond of bathing, extraordinarily so by the standards of his age, which was not an age that valued prolonged immersion in warm water the way we might. Even in the years of the campaigns, he had sought it out. But on St. Helena, in the slow contracting world of his last years, The bath became something else entirely. It became the center. The tub was brought into his rooms at Longwood House and filled with water heated as hot as it could be made, which on a damp Atlantic island with a struggling staff and inconsistent supplies was a small logistical operation in itself. The steam rose into the already humid air of the bedroom. The smell in that room would have been particular: warm water, the mineral quality of the island's water supply, soap, and beneath it, the close air of a man who was increasingly spending whole days in a confined interior. He would lower himself in, and he would stay, sometimes 2 hours, sometimes 3, sometimes longer than that. The physician Barry O'Meara, who attended Napoleon from 1815 until his removal from the island in 1818, documented the bath habit with a kind of professional bewilderment. The water would cool and be reheated, and Napoleon would remain, submerged to the chest, occasionally calling for someone to read to him, occasionally dictating, occasionally simply still, his eyes open, looking at the ceiling of a room on an island in the middle of an ocean. I want to sit with that image for a moment, because I find it genuinely moving in a way that is hard to articulate precisely. Here is a man who had crossed the Alps, who had stood in the smoke of Austerlitz, who had governed an empire from the Pyrenees to the borders of Russia, and his final sanctuary, the place he returned to every morning of his last years, was a bathtub in a damp house on a small island. Not as defeat, as comfort, the bath was the one place where the abdominal pain that had been building since at least 1817 became, if not absent, then bearable. The warmth penetrated in a way that nothing else did, and so he went there, and stayed, and the household moved quietly around the closed door, and the steam drifted, and Napoleon floated in the only ease available to him. By 1817, his body was in serious and accelerating trouble. The abdominal symptoms, pain in the upper right quadrant, nausea, vomiting, a progressive inability to eat normally, had been present in some form since at least the second year on St. Helena, and possibly earlier. He was losing weight in a way that alarmed those around him. The legs that had once carried him across the battlefields of Europe were swelling now, particularly toward the end. He tired easily, slept poorly, and found that the damp cold of the Longwood Plateau, that persistent, penetrating Atlantic chill, cut into him in a way it had never done before. What the popular account almost always flattens, and what I think deserves to be restored, is the specific texture of what this deterioration felt like from the inside of ordinary days. He could not eat. This, in its way, was the sentence that governed everything. Napoleon had never been an especially interested eater. He had been famous in the campaign years for his speed at table, for consuming meals in under 10 minutes, for his indifference to the elaborate ceremonial dining that surrounded him. But food had always been fuel, reliably converted. Now even small amounts caused pain. By 1819 and into 1820, the household accounts and the testimony of those present, Bertrand, Marchand, Montholon, record with quiet accumulating distress that the emperor was often refusing meals entirely or accepting small portions of broth that he would sometimes manage to keep down and sometimes not. The kitchen at Longwood worked with what it had, which was often inadequate. The provisioning of the household was a running dispute with Governor Hudson Lowe that added its own particular humiliation to everything else, and the cook attempted dishes that might tempt an appetite that had largely gone. The smell of food in those rooms, which had once been neutral or even welcome, was becoming difficult. On certain mornings, Napoleon could not be in the same space as a meal being prepared. He would retreat, to the garden if the weather permitted, which it often did not, to the bath, to the narrow interior spaces of Longwood, where at least he could control what reached him. His weight loss, by the testimonies of those who had known him in his fuller years, was striking and distressing. Marchand, his devoted first valet, who had been with Napoleon since the 100 Days and who remained with him until the end, would years later write a memoir in which the deterioration of those final years is recorded with a kind of precise and heartbroken witness. The man he was dressing each morning was becoming, in some physical sense, smaller. Let me step back for a moment, because there is something worth sitting with here. A question that has genuinely not been resolved, and I think you'll find it surprising, or rather, I think you'll find it both surprising and rather strange, that we still do not know, with any certainty, what killed Napoleon Bonaparte, the most documented man of his age. The subject of somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 books, depending on which estimate you accept. The man whose every movement, every utterance, every bowel irregularity was recorded by a household of witnesses keeping meticulous notes, and we cannot say with confidence what ended his life on the 5th of May, 1821. The official cause, established by the autopsy conducted the following day by the physician Francesco Antomarchi, was stomach cancer, a perforated ulcer in a stomach, compromised by cancerous growth. This remained the accepted explanation for well over a century. It fits the symptoms: the abdominal pain, the weight loss, the vomiting, the progressive failure to eat. All of it is consistent with gastric cancer, particularly in a man who may have had a hereditary predisposition, as his father Carlo had also died of what was described as a stomach complaint. But in 1960, a forensic study of Napoleon's hair, conducted by the Swedish toxicologist Sten Forsufud, found elevated levels of arsenic, significantly elevated, the kind of elevation that suggested not incidental environmental exposure, but deliberate, repeated administration over time. The green wallpaper hypothesis followed. Scheele's green, a fashionable pigment used widely in early 19th century interiors and containing copper arsenite, which in damp conditions could be converted by mold into a toxic gas, arsenic trihydride. The walls of Longwood were damp. The wallpaper was green. The household breathed that air for years. The historian Ben Wider, and later the toxicologist Pascal Kintz, pushed the deliberate poisoning hypothesis further, arguing that the arsenic levels in Napoleon's hair pointed to acute doses administered close to the time of death, rather than slow chronic exposure. The finger, in those arguments, has pointed variously at Montholon, who stood to benefit financially, or at British government policy, or at Bourbon restoration interests. None of it has been definitively proven. The counter-argument, that arsenic was present in many period medicines, that Napoleon was taking tartar emetic and calomel and other compounds that complicate the picture enormously, remains equally unresolved. The honest answer is that we do not know. And I find the uncertainty itself historically interesting, in a way that goes beyond the detective story. That the most written about human being in Western history died of causes we cannot fully account for. That all that documentation, all those witnesses with their notebooks and their competing loyalties, and their desperate need to record and to remember, still left us with an open question at the very center, says something rather beautiful and rather humbling about the limits of the historical record. Back to Napoleon in the bath. Back to the warm water and the steam and the closed door. The biographer Andrew Roberts, in his comprehensive 2014 Life of Napoleon, notes the particular quality of Napoleon's endurance in those final years. Not the dramatic endurance of the battlefield, which had its own audience and its own rewards, but a quieter and in some ways harder kind. The pain was chronic and often severe. The treatments available were largely useless or actively harmful. The mercury compounds, the antimony, the bleedings and the purgatives that the medicine of the period offered, which we now understand did more damage than good. And Napoleon bore most of it with a composure that those around him found difficult to witness. We cannot know what he felt in the private hours, in the bath, in the dark of a night when the Atlantic wind came off the water, and the house groaned, and the pain in his abdomen was the only thing there was. The records do not go that far in, but Bertrand's notebooks, those remarkable, often raw private journals that the general kept throughout the St. Helena years, and which were published in English translation by Francis Cage Frenet, record moments when Napoleon's composure slipped briefly, when he spoke of the pain in terms that were not heroic, not dignified, not for any record, simply honest. The body hurting, the body failing, the admission of it to a trusted friend in a room where no mythology was required. What the popular account almost always forgets, and what I keep returning to, what I find myself thinking about in the way you think about something that genuinely unsettles the comfortable story, is the contrast that those years embodied. The body breaking down while the mind stayed largely, remarkably clear. He was still reading, still discussing, still on his moored. There is something I want to sit with for a moment before we go any further. We have come a long way together tonight. We have been on that island. We have walked the damp grounds of Longwood. We have watched the slow collapse of a body that once seemed, to half the world, almost superhuman. And I think by now you understand what I have been trying to show you. That the story of St. Helena is not only a story about defeat, or bitterness, or the cruelty of distance. It is a story about what happens to a person when the performance is finally, irrevocably over. But there is a particular kind of evidence I have been saving, not the grand statements, not the dictated memoirs or the political calculations or the carefully arranged mythology. I want to tell you about what Napoleon said when he did not know or did not care that he was being recorded, the private talk, the informal evenings, the things that slipped out beside the fire that were never supposed to travel beyond that particular damp and smoky room. Because it turns out, and this is what I find genuinely astonishing, those things survived. The candles at Longwood burned low most evenings by 9 or 10 o'clock. The house smelled of tallow and damp wood, and something faintly mineral, the island's particular humidity getting into everything, into the curtains, into the paper of the books stacked along the walls, into the wool of the rugs that Napoleon had brought from Paris, and that were now slowly going soft and pale with moisture. On the better evenings, when his stomach was not troubling him too badly, Napoleon would not go directly to bed after dinner. He would settle into a chair near the fire, a smaller chair than you might imagine, chosen for practicality rather than ceremony, and he would talk. Not dictate, not perform, talk. The men who were with him on those evenings, General Gaspard Gourgaud, the Grand Marshal Henri Gratien Bertrand, and the faithful Barry O'Meara, the Irish surgeon who was also, quietly, reporting back to London, were careful men in their different ways. They kept notes. They kept diaries. They wrote things down that they were not necessarily supposed to write down, and it is from those documents, accumulated across years, published piecemeal over the following decades, that the most honest portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte, at the end of his life, slowly, haltingly, emerged. Let me tell you about how those documents survived, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because it matters for understanding what we actually have. The formal record of St. Helena the Great. Mémorial de Sainte-Hélène. Compiled by the Count de Las Caisses and published in 1823, 2 years after Napoleon's death, was a curated object. Las Caisses was devoted, but he was also an editor. He understood that he was constructing something for posterity, and posterity required a certain grandeur of tone. What emerged from the memorial was remarkable and valuable, but it was also shaped, lightly, carefully, but unmistakably shaped, by what Las Caisses believed Napoleon's legacy should look like. The other documents were different. Gourgaud's journals, for instance, were not published until 1899, almost 8 decades after Napoleon's death. Gourgaud had been asked, and in some cases pressured, by Napoleon's surviving family and by the keepers of the Bonapartist flame, to keep them private. There were things in them, you see, that complicated the legend. Bertrand's notebooks, his personal, private jottings, separate from the more formal accounts he later published, were even more protected. The most intimate portions were not fully available to scholars until well into the 20th century. The historian Jean Toulard and others working in the French archival tradition spent considerable effort disentangling what had been published, what had been selectively published, and what had been quietly withheld by families who understood, quite rightly, that what they were holding was dynamite. Barry O'Meara's. Napoleon in Exile. Published in 1822, caused a genuine scandal, not only for what it said about Governor Hudson Lowe's treatment of Napoleon, but for the unguarded quality of the Napoleon it revealed. O'Meara had kept detailed private memoranda alongside his published account. Some of what appeared in print was more diplomatic than what he had actually written in the moment. The private memoranda were sharper. What all of these documents share, across their different authors, their different levels of proximity, their different degrees of candor, is a Napoleon who is recognizable, and yet who does not quite match the statue. Back with Napoleon now, beside the fire, in his dressing gown. The dressing gown was grey. There are enough accounts that agree on this detail that it feels safe to hold it. He wore it in the evenings, and it became, in a life that had been so thoroughly costumed, so precisely calibrated for visual effect, a kind of unofficial uniform of the private self. The man who had worn the grey overcoat on the battlefield, who had understood better than almost any modern figure how much image governed reality, now sat in his grey dressing gown in the firelight and said things that no image manager would have approved. He made jokes about his own campaigns. This is one of the things I find genuinely moving, the capacity for self-deprecating humour in a man the myth insists was entirely without irony. Gourgaud records several evenings where Napoleon recounted specific military decisions with something approaching genuine amusement at his own earlier certainty. The particular bright confidence of a younger man who had not yet been to Russia. He did not precisely say he had been wrong, but the laughter was there, the raised eyebrow at his own past self. Something in that particular quality of humour, the kind that can only come from real distance, from having survived long enough to find your younger certainties a little absurd, that feels to me like one of the most human things in all 6 years of those records. He admitted doubt about specific moments, not the wholesale recantation that his admirers feared and his critics demanded, but something quieter and, I think, more honest. The historian Peter Geil, whose 1949 study, Napoleon, For and Against, remains one of the most penetrating analyses of how Napoleon's reputation has been constructed and dismantled across generations, noted that the St. Helena documents reveal a man genuinely capable of revisiting his own decisions without the defensive closure that public self-justification requires. In private, there was a quality of actual thinking, of returning to a question and turning it over. He was tender with children, the island children, the children of the small British garrison, and the local population who occasionally came near Longwood, are mentioned in several accounts. Napoleon, who in his imperial years had a complicated and often instrumentalized relationship with children as dynastic objects, appears in the St. Helena records to have had a simply and quietly genuine warmth for them. He gave them sweets from what was available. He asked their names. He remembered the names. There is something in that particular detail, the remembering of a child's name, in a life otherwise consumed by the memorization of generals, marshals, ministers, the machinery of power, that lands differently than I expected when I first encountered it. And then there is Josephine. I want to be careful here, because the evidence is real but incomplete, and I think the incompleteness is itself part of what makes it worth attending to. Josephine de Beauharnais, his first wife, divorced in 1809 for reasons that were genuinely dynastic. Napoleon needed an heir, and Josephine had not provided one, died in May 1814, just after his first abdication, while he was on his way to Elba. He never saw her again after the divorce. Several accounts from people present at Malmaison in the days after the first abdication suggest that he visited her there, that they spoke privately, that whatever had been between them had never been fully resolved by the formalities of dissolution. On St. Helena, in the private evenings, her name came up. O'Meara recorded at least one occasion where Napoleon spoke of her, not in the manner of official utterance, not for the legend, but simply, quietly, in the way that people speak of those they have genuinely loved and lost, and do not quite know how to place in the architecture of their life's meaning. The biographer Alan Shom and separately the French scholar André Castelot, in his biography of Josephine, both noted the quality of tenderness in these references, a tenderness that was carefully absent from Napoleon's more public constructions of his own emotional life. We cannot know, with any certainty, the full interior of what he felt. The records hint at something. It is tempting to imagine that in those firelit evenings, in the grey dressing gown, far from everything he had built and lost, the person he allowed himself to grieve most privately was not the empire, not the throne, not the son he would never see again. Though all of those losses were real and documented and present, it is tempting to imagine that somewhere in the particular quiet of those evenings was the shape of a woman in a garden at Malmaison, roses she had cultivated obsessively, a face he had found and failed and never entirely let go. The fire would burn lower, the candles guttered in the damp air. The men in the room would grow quiet, understanding, as people who have spent long time in close proximity to someone always eventually understand, when the talking was finished for the night. And Napoleon would rise from his chair, the dressing gown settling around him, and move through the dark house toward his narrow bed, and the island would be quiet around him, and the South Atlantic would go on breathing its vast, indifferent breath in the darkness beyond the walls. The wind at Longwood had been blowing for days. This is one of those details that gets noted in the accounts and then somehow never quite makes it into the story. The wind at Longwood, that particular, relentless, salt-carrying wind that came off the Atlantic and struck the plateau where Napoleon's residence sat, as though it had been aimed there deliberately, was a constant companion in those final days. The physician Barry O'Meara had written about it years earlier, the way it came through the ill-fitting windows and moved through the rooms, and made everything slightly damp to the touch, regardless of what season it was. By the first days of May 1821, Napoleon had been bedridden for weeks. The wind was still there. You could hear it working at the edges of the house. A low, continuous sound, not dramatic, not howling, just present. The kind of sound that, if you are sick enough, becomes the sound of the world itself, reminding you it will continue without you. I want to be honest with you about something. I have been thinking about how to write this section for a long time because I think the way we tell the story of someone's death reveals what we actually believe their life was for. The standard account of Napoleon's death, and it is a reasonable account, historically accurate in its broad outlines, tends to reach for significance. The great man dying, the final exile completed, history turning its page. And those things are true, but they can crowd out something else, something quieter. Something that I find, genuinely, more affecting than the grand narrative. What the accounts record, if you read them carefully, is an ordinary room, a man in a narrow bed. People who loved him in their complicated, sometimes maddening, intensely human ways gathered around him. The candles burning because the curtains were drawn against a grey May light, the smell of camphor and vinegar, the sound of breathing that was no longer regular, the particular domestic weight of watching someone leave. By late April 1821, Napoleon could no longer eat. The stomach pains that had tormented him intermittently for years had become constant, and the vomiting was severe. He was 51 years old, and he looked older, the heaviness that had settled on him in exile now giving way to something that was simply diminishment, the body reducing itself. General Henri Gatien Bertrand, who had followed Napoleon from Elba to St. Helena and would not leave him, sat with him in shifts. The Countess Albine de Montholon was present. The physician Antommarchi, whose conduct before and after the death would be disputed, attended him. The small, strange, profoundly loyal household of Longwood was assembled. On the evening of May 4th, Napoleon appeared to rally slightly. He had moments of something almost like clarity between the episodes of delirium. In the delirium, those gathered around him heard him speak of battles, of his son, of France. The biographer Andrew Roberts, in his comprehensive 2014 study of Napoleon, notes that these delirious utterances were recorded by members of the household, some almost certainly shaped in the retelling, as such things always are, but that the name of his son was audibly present. The boy he had not seen since 1814. The boy who was by then, though Napoleon did not know how things would go, living under a different name in Vienna, his imperial identity carefully managed into obsolescence by the Habsburg court. The night of the 4th and the morning of the 5th were still. The wind, which had been the house's perpetual companion, seems to have gentled in those hours. At least, the accounts don't mention it, and the accounts tend to mention it when it's present. It is possible this is simply an omission. It is also possible that the stillness was real, and that the people in that room felt it, and that it meant something to them in the way that small atmospheric coincidences can come to mean something when everything else is very large. Napoleon Bonaparte died on May 5, 1821, at approximately 5:49 in the evening. He was 51 years and 4 months old. The candles were still burning in the grey afternoon light. Bertrand, who had stood beside him at Austerlitz and Waterloo, and across years of exile, was in the room. The physician Antommarchi confirmed the death. Outside, eventually, the wind would have resumed. I find this genuinely difficult to sit with, and I mean that as a compliment to the history, not a criticism. There is something in that room I don't want to turn away from too quickly, even at this late hour. Let me stay here just a moment longer. The autopsy was performed the following day. Antommarchi's report identified a stomach ulcer and, in his account, significant disease of the stomach, phrasing that has kept historians and medical researchers in productive disagreement ever since. The question of whether Napoleon died of stomach cancer, of a perforated ulcer, or of something else entirely, including, in one contested line of modern research, chronic arsenic poisoning, though historians remain deeply divided on whether this was deliberate or the result of the arsenic-laden wallpaper paste then common in damp climates, is genuinely unresolved, and probably will remain so. What the autopsy record does confirm, unambiguously, is that his stomach was the site of the suffering. The organ that had been his most persistent physical complaint across his adult life had been, in the end, the thing that ended him. He was buried on the island 4 days later, in a valley he had reportedly admired during his walks, the Torbitz Spring Valley, near a willow-shaded stream. The willows were his. He had requested them specifically, according to multiple accounts of the burial arrangements. There was something characteristic in that, the practical mind attending to detail even in the planning of its own interment. 4 willow trees were planted at the grave, and then Longwood's garden, the one he had worked in his last years, the one he had planted with hands that had once directed the movement of 200,000 men, continued growing in the damp Atlantic air of St. Helena, tended by whoever tended it, or not tended, growing anyway. Let me tell you about what happened 19 years later, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because I think it completes something the story needs completing. In 1840, the July monarchy of King Louis Philippe engaged in a complicated piece of political theatre that was also, beneath the theatre, something genuinely felt, negotiated with the British government for the return of Napoleon's remains to France. The Retour des Cendres, the return of the ashes, though it was, technically, a rather more intact body than that phrase implies, the coffins having been extraordinarily effective at preservation, took place across the final months of that year. The frigate Belle Poule carried the remains from St. Helena to France. General Bertrand, then in his late 60s, made the voyage again. He stood beside the coffin on the open sea, crossing the same water he had crossed in the other direction 25 years before. What that crossing felt like for him, history does not record precisely, and I think it is right not to invent it. The biographer David Bell has written about how the Retour des Cendres functioned as a kind of national psychological event, the country processing, all at once and in public, a grief that had been diffuse and complicated and privately held for 2 decades. The remains arrived in Paris on December 15, 1840. 500,000 people stood in the winter cold, along the route from the Invalides. 500,000. The temperature was below freezing. The ink in the journalists' pens kept solidifying and requiring warming before they could write. And still the people stood, in the particular silence of enormous crowds, watching the passage of a hearse carrying a man who had been dead for 19 years, a man many of them had not been born when he last governed anything, and they wept. Writers present that day described something that went beyond political sentiment, something that resembled, in its quality, genuine mourning. The scholar Sudhir Hazare Singh, in his study of the Napoleonic legend, has argued that the Retour des Cendres revealed a specific human need, not the need for Napoleon as an idea, but the need for a body, a place, somewhere specific to go and stand and feel what couldn't quite be felt otherwise. That need is one of the oldest human things there is. Let me bring you back now, back to the island, back to the quiet end of things, back to what history quietly forgot to record. Napoleon's son, the boy he called. The eaglet, the King of Rome reduced to the Duke of Reichstadt, living carefully in Vienna under Habsburg eyes, died in July 1832 at the age of 21 of tuberculosis. He never ruled, he never returned to France. He never stood at his father's grave. He had last seen his father at the age of 3. Whatever he carried of that man, the memory, the resemblance that contemporaries remarked on, the inheritance of an identity that had been simultaneously his birthright and his cage, he carried without ceremony, in a court that had every interest in keeping his imperial associations dim and decorative. He died in the Schönbrunn Palace, in a room with tall windows. He was 21 years old. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the lonelier figures of the 19th century, a man whose entire life was aftermath. And here is the thing that I keep returning to, the thing that this section, this whole long journey through St. Helena's damp rooms and difficult gardens, has been quietly building toward. The last light on St. Helena. Let me slow down now. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, you and I. We have moved through the noise and the colour of it, the island, the damp rooms, the arguments over protocol, the dictation, the garden, the slow and complicated business of a man trying to decide what he meant and what he wanted history to say about him. There has been a lot of it, and I want to gently set most of it down now, the way you set a lamp down on a table at the end of a long evening, carefully, with some gratitude for the light it gave. But I want to keep one image for just a little longer. I keep returning to the same room, a small room. The windows not quite large enough, the light from a candle that had been burning for some time, the wax pooled low in its dish, the flame doing that particular slow lean it does when the air in a closed room has grown very still. And Napoleon, not the emperor, not the general, not the mythmaker, simply a man in his middle 50s, sitting, sometimes reading, sometimes doing nothing that anyone recorded, which is perhaps the most honest thing the historical record ever accidentally captured about him. The moments when no one wrote anything down because there was, apparently, nothing to write. I find those moments genuinely moving. I think about them more than I probably should, because here is what I keep coming back to, and I will try to say it simply, without making it bigger than it needs to be. The last years of Napoleon on St. Helena were, in some ways, the most thoroughly documented period of his entire life. And yet what that documentation mostly captured was the performance, the dictation, the complaints, the careful construction of the legend. What it missed, or what it recorded accidentally, sideways, in the margins of other things, was something quieter. The man who walked in the garden when he thought no one was watching. The man who asked about the weather on the mainland not for any strategic reason, simply because he had been a long time away from the kind of weather he understood in his body. The man who, according to at least some of those who were with him, could sometimes be found sitting with no book, no paper, no visitor, in a silence that no one quite knew what to do with. Perhaps that is the thing history quietly forgot to record. Not a secret, not a scandal, Not even a revelation exactly. Simply the ordinary interior life of a person who had, for most of his adult years, been too busy, or too surrounded, or too much observed to have much of one. Or if he had, no one had thought it worth setting down. I find myself wondering whether that is what St. Helena actually was, underneath the exile, underneath the humiliation, and the damp, and the arguments with Hudson Lowe. Whether it was, in some unbidden and unrequested way, the first sustained period of his life in which Napoleon Bonaparte was left alone long enough to simply be a person, without a battle to plan, without an empire to manage, without a role to perform at quite such volume. I do not know if he found that restful or unbearable. The evidence suggests it was probably both, at different hours. But I think that ambiguity is the honest truth of it, and I find it, genuinely, more interesting than the legend, more worth sitting with, more recognizably human. You do not need to hold on to any of the details now. Let them go. Let the island recede. Let the names soften, the dates dissolve, the particular geography of St. Helena grow vague and gentle and far away. None of it needs to be gripped. It will be there if you want it. Whatever your own evening has held tonight, wherever you are, whatever the room around you looks like, whether it is warm or cool, whether the window has rain on it or stars, whether the house is quiet or there is still some small sound somewhere of the world going about its business, I hope you are comfortable. I hope the weight of the day is beginning to lift from you, the way it does when you have finally given yourself permission to stop. Let your breathing do the work now. It knows how. Somewhere, very far away across an ocean that no longer needs to mean anything to you tonight, there is a small island in the South Atlantic. The wind comes off the water at this hour and moves through the grass on the hillside, and the stars above it are, by all accounts, extraordinary, more stars than most people ever see in a lifetime, because the island is so remote and the sky above it so unpolluted by any human light. They were there for Napoleon. They are there still. Let that be the last image. Stars over a dark island, grass moving in the wind, a candle, somewhere inside, burning quietly down. Sleep well, friend. Good night, wherever you are.